Everyone, and welcome to the live streaming edition of Everything Compliance. Today we have Jonathan Armstrong, Matt Kelly, Mike Volkov, and Jonathan Marks will be dropping in to join us as well. Gentlemen, happy Good Friday.
And to you.
Thank you, Tom.
And to you, and to you, and to all our listeners.
Mr. Armstrong, what is on your mind these days?
Well, I've got something quite topical. Many of you who have UK operations will have had these somewhat aggressive letters arrive to your UK registered office sent from the UK government, an official looking letter telling you that you've got to file some details with the UK Modern Slavery Registry by April 9th, and that deadline is obviously pretty close. And for many organizations, that's come completely out of the blue. So I thought I'd explain what that's about and whether the deadline of April the 9th is a hard one or not. So first of all, the UK, obviously, and we've talked about this on these podcasts before, I think genuinely cares about slavery, and particularly so-called modern slavery. It's a misnomer because there ain't anything modern about it. It's still holding people captive and against their will. And that's as old as the Roman Empire, if not before. And the UK, I think, rightly, is ashamed of its past and its connections with the slave trade, and there has been a move in the past 6, 7, 8 years to try and correct that again. The UK, obviously, whilst it had a despicable role in the slave trade, was also, I think, the first nation to ban slavery and had a crusade in the 1800s led by people like William Wilberforce to stamp out slavery across the world. But the job's only half done, and we see slaves both in foreign climes and in nail bars and car washes and beauty salons 200, 300, 400 yards away from the places that we live and work. And the UK has been on something of a crusade again since November. Against slavery, and particularly against the slavery in the Xinjiang region of China, and particularly those Uyghur Muslims who are, it seems, held in a abject condition. And in October, a UK parliamentary commission or committee summoned a number of large organizations, including, for example, the Disney Corporation, to attend a parliamentary hearing on November 5th. And some of those summonses were sent as a result of inaccurate information that had been collected from Chinese corporations. Now, some of the research in this area is a bit odd, to say the least. For example, some of the research reports say you cannot trust anything that Chinese manufacturers say, and the following businesses use Chinese suppliers. And how do we know that? Because we've got the word of the Chinese manufacturers for that. So a lot of the arguments from the activists and researchers are somewhat circular, but there is no doubt a problem with Chinese supply chains. And the parliamentary committee recently made a number of recommendations in its report. And one of those recommendations was that sanctions be stepped up against the officials in Xinjiang who were thought to be behind some of these atrocities. And the UK was part of a consensus in bringing sanctions, which involved the US and the EU. And as a result of those sanctions, some of the MPs who'd written this parliamentary report and some of the people who were involved in research which led to the parliamentary report were then sanctioned by China as a retaliatory move. Now, just as those actions were somewhat predictable, it was also entirely predictable that sanctioning people like that does not silence them. It spurs them into more action. And that's partly why we've got the spotlight on this modern slavery register, which was only just recently launched, and I think had few people sign up to it. It's voluntary at this stage. It may become mandatory, and it's connected to UK modern slavery law, which has been in for 5 years or so now, but with few teeth. And these letters that people have got seem to imply that registration is mandatory and it must be done by April 9th. That isn't the case, but as a result of those letters, the register has gone from only government entities, more or less, having signed up to almost so well over 4,000 corporations having signed up in about 10 days. And it either tells you that people obey any letter that comes from government, whether it's got legal force or not, or it tells you that more than 4,000 corporations are convinced that they're squeaky clean on slavery and want to shout that out to the world, or that they are prepared to put what you might call partial statements out to say, we've done some stuff, but we're not anyway through the work. And this is quite consequential for a lot of corporations, because you'd expect somebody senior to sign the statement. And a lot of CEOs seem to have signed statements to say that there is no slavery in their supply chains. And I think that's a fairly incredible statement for any CEO of a large corporation to make. You know, how does he know? We know, for example, that if you source goods and materials from some parts of the world, you can't rely on audits because auditors can't get in. Or in some parts of the world, Turkey, for example, I'm told that the cost of doing something correct is about 100 times the cost of bribing somebody to say you've done it correctly. So in these parts of the world where supply chains hit that are prone to corruption, I think it's a very brave CEO that's prepared to sign off to say that no slavery exists in their supply chain. And it seems to me that this is going to be a really big issue on everybody's agenda in the next few months. I know that in the US, for example, there's also very strong protest groups. There's a lot of boycotting on both sides. H&M, for example, were initially boycotted, or there was a move to boycott H&M products in the UK until they were sanctioned by the Chinese government. And their sales, their sentiment's gone up for H&M on the basis of anybody who's an enemy of China must therefore be somebody we should shop from, not the obverse. And the Chinese authorities have done all sorts of things to try and promote a boycott of H&M in China. For example, I understand taking the locations of H&M stores off maps, so you can't order a taxi to get there because the taxi drivers can't find their premises, etc., etc. So all of this, I think, is an emerging topic at the moment. The deadline of the 9th of April doesn't have any legal basis at all. It's a slightly interesting exercise that government is sort of pretending they have the power to do something when they don't. But organizations still need to take slavery very seriously. Firstly, because it's the right thing to do. Secondly, because the compliance obligations are increasing. And thirdly, because pressure group activity is intense in this area and people are voting with their feet.
Jonathan, where does a compliance officer or other corporate official, a C-suite executive, where would you suggest they start? Would they audit their supply chain? Would they go down the hall and see, are we making payments to any nefarious characters? If someone really wanted to see, one, are we in compliance, or two, even set up a program to be in compliance, where do you suggest they start?
I think awareness is important from the very start. So that's going to be awareness with your suppliers. It's going to be contractual obligations on suppliers as well. Awareness for your own people. As I've said, slaves are amongst us as well as in foreign countries. So how would you spot a slave in the garage that services your corporate vehicles? You've got to invest in that education, I think. Auditing, I think, is bound to be part of it, with the caveats that some countries are almost inauditable. So you've got to think whether they're countries that you should be in at all. And that's not as easy as you think. You know, the parliamentary inquiry heard evidence relating to Leicester in the UK, where audits were incredibly difficult because of the close-knit nature of that community and their ability to disguise where the goods were actually being created. So there are no quick fix answers. For anybody who is interested, if they look at, you could look at the Caudry website, for example. You could look at the UK government's Modern Slavery Unit website, where there are 6 things that it suggests that you might want to cover in your modern slavery statement. Of course, the goal isn't just to make a statement, it's to improve year on year as well. But those 6 areas will at least be, I think, a good start for any program. And that, coupled with awareness, at least will start people off on their journey.
Jonathan Marks, do you have a question for Jonathan Armstrong?
I guess my question for Jonathan is with regards to, slavery and all the things that you spoke about. How sensitive do you think organizations are right now to deal with those issues? I recall working on a matter probably about 6 or 7 years ago that involved some of this. And what I found to be more disturbing was that I believe the organization knew about it, but sort of turned a blind eye. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are with regards to all of this. And, and we all know about the public, the public company issues, but I'm just worried about the private corporations as well, globally.
Yeah. I think it's a great question, and I think awareness wasn't very good. So I can recall maybe 2 years ago, there was an issue with a large London law firm, and it turned out that all of their security guards were held in a position of slavery. They're all from the same village in Asia, and their relatives, it seemed, were their relatives were still home, and they were told to work, and their passports were confiscated, and they're sitting on the reception desk of a well-known large law firm. And presumably the law firm didn't recognize that the people guarding their premises were captives. And that obviously has all sorts of ramifications, not only slavery, but also if these people are loyal to the gangmaster rather than the people they're meant to be, people and premises they're meant to be protecting, then there are all sorts of issues around information security. The law firm's obviously handling highly sensitive deals, and the fact that the people on the front desk are compromised means that all of the data in the building is compromised as well. And I think a lot of it has been an awareness issue. There's this great case study about one of the American airlines who started training stewardesses in how to spot people on planes that were held in conditions of slavery or were being trafficked. And they've done a great job, and I believe most cabin crew in the US now have training on this. And once you can spot the signs, you do have concerns about people you interact with on a daily basis. On trains, as I've said, car washes, in nail bars, etc., etc. And I think some of us have to rethink our personal behaviors as well as our corporate behaviors, and awareness isn't where it should be, Jonathan.
Matt Kelly, what is on your mind?
Well, I have been writing, in fact, just before we got on here, about corporate America's latest ethics and politics headache, which is this voter suppression law in Georgia, which has immediately blown up into the face of numerous large companies that are headquartered in Georgia. And I am thinking about it because this is just, I think, a small taste of what is about to come for a lot of businesses. This is not necessarily a corporate compliance issue per se, or internal control or internal audit, but really getting to the ethical values that corporations put up on their mission statement, they talk about all the time. And now we have our political climate, which is really going to test how much corporations are trying to put those ethics into practice and hold true to their words. So here's what's going on, is that on March 25th, Georgia, down south, they enacted this voter suppression law. It was passed under the guise of voter integrity, which is a lie. There is no problem with the integrity of the votes in Georgia. The problem for white conservative lawmakers in Georgia was that the urban and diverse groups down in Georgia actually voted for President Biden in November and then sent 2 Democratic senators to Congress, which, of course, white conservatives in Georgia said, we can't have that. Let's knock it off. Let's pass this voter suppression bill, which they did. It is now the law in Georgia. What really intrigued me first was the CEO of Delta, Ed Bastian, and Delta is headquartered in Atlanta. It is, I think, the largest private employer in the state of Georgia. If it isn't, it's one of the largest employers in Georgia. The day after they passed the law, he put out this wishy-washy statement that basically said, we worked with the legislators, we got rid of some of the really bad stuff, we're happy that we made such good progress, thank you and good night. And nobody stood up for that. Nobody stood for it. He was left on the back foot because almost immediately many others in social media started saying corporations should have done more. And the biggest corporations in Georgia are Home Depot, Coca-Cola, Delta, UPS. And so what has happened so far is that the Black CEOs of America, they signed an open letter earlier this week, about 72 of them, including the CEO of Merck and the former CEO of American Express, who seem to be the leaders of this, I think it's called Black Votes Matter movement, if I have it right. But the Black CEOs are basically saying it is time for corporate America to get off the sidelines. Either you are in favor of democracy and equal protection under the law, or you're not. The Republican Party has clearly said they're not, but corporations have to say that they are, because actually equality and fairness and support for democracy are a lot of the values that they either profess, or the rest of America, the Democratic majority that put President Biden into power, they're the ones who are supporting these open standards, very much against what the Republicans are trying to do. And I have been amazed at how Delta in particular mishandled this, because once everybody kind of woke up several days later to the menace that this law is in Georgia, well, then Delta put out a brand new statement where he's like, well, this is all based on a lie and this was terrible and we stand up against these things. And all of that was good for Ed Bastian to say. He just should have said it maybe the first time around instead of the second time around. He claimed in the second time around that he had not fully understood what Georgia lawmakers were doing. I don't believe that. I think that probably, like many CEOs, he was just hoping this difficult issue, the company wouldn't have to take a strong stand on. I don't think that is going to be a lot of room for that kind of excuse anymore. So we've already seen, I think it is the Atlanta Falcons and the Atlanta Hawks have both said that they're opposed to these laws. There is talk that the Major League Baseball might move its All-Star game later this year out Atlanta and Georgia to somewhere else. Like, we've seen all of this before. We have, when you think about it. It was the anti-trans bill in North Carolina, I think it was. There was another one in Indiana where, the state lawmakers passed these bills, somehow oppressing some groups socially, and then everybody gets up in arms, and corporations have to say that we're against this, and then the lawmakers have retreated so far. I'll be curious to see if we have this dynamic play out again with these new voter suppression laws, especially because even if Ed Bastian and his flim-flam excuse that we didn't understand what was in the law in Georgia the first time, if we did, we would have been against it. Okay, even if that's true, well, we have new voter suppression laws in Texas. We have them coming in Arizona. We have them coming in, I believe it is in Florida and in Pennsylvania. You have them everywhere. There are currently 43 states that have Republicans pushing some sort of voter suppression law. And this is really going to leave corporations, like, it's a difficult spot. I don't deny that. But you have a minority of people who are supporting this wackadoo Republican stance now, where this is what I had worried about since Donald Trump lost in November, was that the principles of Trumpism would, rather than go away like they should have, they didn't. They infected the whole Republican Party. And now we have this nonsense of these voter suppression laws. I don't know what a lot of the state legislators are going to come up with next, but how do you as a corporation trying to serve all people at all times deal with this small minority of people now who have just left American democracy on the side of the road? How are you supposed to swim with the rest of us who are generally opposed to voter suppression? They do actually like President Biden. They voted for President Biden. Most of the economic activity in the country comes from congressional districts that support Democrats in Congress and support Joe Biden, and they actually voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016. How do you do that? How do you manage that if you're a corporation? I don't have a good answer other than to firmly tell Republicans we oppose this, and say it from the start. Not after they do something stupid, do it before. But this is going to be a very difficult period. And I am curious to see how many corporations actually will stand up and kind of put their money where their mouth is about ethical values. Occasionally, guys, this stuff actually does matter. And I think this is going to be one of those periods. Here we are.
Matt, other than perhaps trying to stay aware of what's going on in the political winds and following legislative debates, should a compliance function, a comms function, or other corporate function really be prepared to respond in a moment's notice? Or I almost sense from you, you need to have a longer term plan, which might include early statements, which might include engagement, which might include companies talking about the diverse nature of their workforces and why certain legislation might be antithetical to the corporate mission in not only their home state, but across the United States, or is it really something else?
I mean, yes and no. Do you need a long-term plan as a CEO to say we support democracy and equal protection under the law and voter fairness? I mean, no, you don't need a plan for that. That should be instinct, for Pete's sake. Come on. At the same time, should you be monitoring what is going on in state capitals? Yes. But I would say that is why most large companies do have some sort of vice president of legislative affairs or something like that. And if a CEO really does not know that there's a hot button legislative issue coming along that might put us in a difficult spot and we need to respond to it, if you don't know that, then find your VP of legislative affairs and fire that person for not doing their job, which is to brief the CEO and understand what the CEO wants, and then try and do something to steer the legislation in the direction the company likes. That's not news either. Companies have done that for hundreds of years. So it's just, there's a certain bit of eye rolling here that I don't think it is very hard to know what the right thing to do is. It's going to be hard to say that out loud because you will inevitably get about 30% of the population who are going to screech and clatter that you are politicizing your corporate views. Yeah, okay. I mean, support for democracy is a political view. Okay, and you're going to stand behind it. I don't see what the big deal would be there, and I don't think most other Americans would. but you got the 30% who are really going to have a big problem with it, and you're still going to have to deal with them. So like I said, I don't know that this is a corporate compliance issue per se. I don't know if you want to call it a mishmash of regulatory affairs and basic corporate ethics in CEO leadership. It's probably in there somewhere. I do think that a lot of CEOs might need to get over themselves, that this isn't something you're going to be able to avoid. You are going to have to take a difficult stance on it, and is going to have to take it publicly. Yes, this storm ultimately, I think, will pass, or whether the storm will recede, because it's only about 30 to 35% of the population that really supports these extremist Trumpist views. But we are where we are. And like I said, okay, we've done it in Georgia. I suspect we haven't heard the last of how the Georgia law is going to stand or go into effect or be amended or something like that. But it was only the first. And if you really say the atrocious, then turn your focus to Texas and Arizona, because they're next, and then go on after that. And corporations are going to have to think about this.
Mike Volkov, what is on your mind? You are on mute.
My apologies. I think this kind of dovetails with the earlier discussion, both by Jonathan and Matt, in that and I've been writing about this lately in terms of risk management. And we've been through, let's say, the pandemic, which sort of exposed risk management in terms of planning and the ability of companies to deal with disruptions. And I think what I've been trying to point out is that there's a pretty good risk manager in every company, and that's your chief compliance officer. That's your chief ethics officer, who are good at risk management. Like, they spend some time, and I'm being a little facetious, with risk prioritization, risk understanding risks, how to mitigate risks. And yet we also see this enterprise risk management function, which compliance is lucky to get involved in, but oftentimes does not have a big seat at the table. And I think if there's anything we learned through this pandemic, is that compliance should be at that table. And also, as people are trying to develop more sophisticated risk management systems, we also see what I think is kind of interesting. Suddenly, companies are elevating the risk management function itself within their organization. And this, to me, is great. It's a welcome sort of development. But I kind of feel that ethics and compliance roles and professionals are not getting sort of their due in that process. And if there's anybody that's good in terms of having line of sight across an organization, developing risk management tools, it's them. But I also want to sort of lead into a little bit more of a discussion that follows Jonathan and Matt, and that is, there's a great movement going on now, and that is the ESG movement, which, by the way, has become so familiar and sort of the hot button issue that people don't even have to spell out what ESG actually stands for. And I think that what Jonathan is talking about in terms of slavery, Matt's talking about in terms of social justice, these are issues that companies are trying to take a sort of more of a look at. And I think it's a welcome development. And I'll tell you why, because I think it's a reflection of the sort of the failure of our political system to deal with many of these issues, because we're at loggerheads with each other and very little's getting done in the way that people really are demanding. So now it's kind of like all the stakeholders, everybody is going back to ESG and demanding companies to deal with some of these problems, like our supply chain audits, like the fact that there was even this week, there was a drive to start a boycott of Coca-Cola. And I think, these are real affirmative statements that companies don't exist in a vacuum. And it's so funny to read some of the early ESG articles now about how do you implement an ESG system? How do you even address it? Well, you think companies have ever had to deal with something like this before? Let me remind them about compliance. Compliance was, when it was the hot button issue, was how do you implement it? Well, I've got a great idea. Let's make everybody a stakeholder and an owner within the company. And suddenly ESG people are saying, we've got a great idea. You should make the business own part of this. And I'm watching this and saying, we've heard this before. So I think the demand for what I would call a greater responsibility, Modern Slavery Act is certainly something important. The political implications of what companies are doing, and frankly, giving corporate donations to Republicans in Georgia is suddenly become a hotbed button issue. So all of this is to say risk has become a broader sort of issue and context, obviously, given the pandemic. Supply chain audits, by the way, was already a big hot button issue with conflict minerals. And then we saw OFAC sanctions guidance, compliance guidance, mandating some kind of supply chain audits. But then you see companies who live in this world, like I'll never forget all the apparel companies who rely on labor from Bangladesh or Malaysia. They have massive sustainability offices, and those offices are supposed to go around and they audit on the ground, and they get into these, unlike some of the areas in China that Jonathan was mentioning, they get into these areas and they supposedly are managing the risk given that fact. So all of these broad themes, I think, are really playing into, what's going to be a transformative type of corporate governance change. And I think it's all for the good in the end. But if we could only get Boris Johnson and our political system over here to be a little bit more collaborative and work a little bit better, maybe the governments could fill in for some of the efforts as well.
Jonathan Marks, do you have a question or comment for Mr. Volkov?
Yeah, I want to know if the regulators are going to start focusing on accurate financial reporting. I mean, ESG is nice. I agree with it, but I think we have bigger issues. I think there's a lot of other things that we need to be aware of, especially in this environment, like financial statement fraud, revenue recognition, things like that. I keep seeing all the enforcement releases. I see all the accounting pronouncements coming out that are concerning people. And so I'm wondering whether, this is nice, but, what are we really focusing on the right things?
Well, that you raise a great question, because it's funny. I've been dealing with the SEC on a couple of matters for clients, and there's a whole cyber office. Obviously, there's a whole disclosure office, and they're ramping up for the kind of disclosures we're going to see about climate change and cybersecurity, and they're getting ready to land on a bunch of companies in those areas. But on the other hand, where's the analytics? Where are the big fraud cases? And I mean, to be honest, Jonathan, name me the biggest fraud case we've had in terms of financial fraud in financial reporting. We know it's out there, but I haven't seen. Have you? I mean, we've seen nothing that's come close to any of our. I mean, I guess the one that I know about is the apparel company, the athletic company. I forgot, based in Baltimore. Yeah, that's the last one that I've heard about. Have you heard of any other ones?
No, but I mean, obviously I can't talk about them for confidentiality reasons, but I mean, we are working on a few, but it's just mind-numbing to me that the same issues, the same prevailing issues year after year after year after year are just, they're not handled appropriately. Rev rec is just constant. And in the pressure cooker environment that we had from last year with regard to COVID, and the fact that, people are dealing with different things, they're trying to make up, one of the enemies of internal controls is incentives and incentive compensation. I wonder if everyone's really focusing in on that. And for people that lost last year or try to maintain what they had, I would imagine like the analytics programs with regards to trends in earnings and things like that. I think, what what did we say? Something about if if you don't take a look at your risk in 2021, 2022 is going to be a zoo. I think that's really what's going to happen. And I think ESG is something. Look, I was involved initially in the social responsibility reform back in 2007, and I was on the front cover of the first magazine that came out, and we talked about all these issues. But the threat landscapes that are around now with regards to what we're dealing with in this particular economy, it's just pretty interesting, and I just don't know.
But Jonathan, I mean, I remember you on the cover of GQ, but I never saw you on the cover of that magazine.
Well, I could show it to you if you'd like.
Okay, but I mean, I saw you on GQ. But you know what? The other point, though, on the SEC front is I thought they had a new sort of analytics approach to identifying potential financial fraud, and they had employed this for a while. And I thought that had led to various investigations. But what it sounds to me like you're saying is that hasn't resulted in any sort of real results or something. Is that what you're?
There's a couple that I know of, and a few that I can't talk about. But I'm just wondering why there aren't more. And maybe there are, and they haven't really come to light yet. I know people were scrambling at the end of the year to get all their SEC issues resolved before the new administration came in. I just wonder, how many the SEC did wind up settling and how many carried over and how many new cases are going to really happen in 2021. I think it's going to be a boon year. I think you're going to see stuff that we haven't seen before. But I agree with you, Mike. There hasn't been a lot of accounting fraud cases that you would look at and say, other than Under Armour and a few others.
Yeah.
Mr. Armstrong, do you have a comment or question for Mr. Volkov?
Yeah, I agree with both of you, actually. I think we're certainly seeing more bad behavior across our desk. And I think that there's a lot of, if you like, legacy bad behavior from the pandemic, which is starting to get exposed. And I think people obviously feel brave at doing stuff in their own home, partly because they've got a lot more time to do whatever bad thing they're doing, and partly because there's nobody's watching over their shoulder and asking them what they're up to. And so the stuff we're seeing already is people like extracting contact lists for whatever purpose or whatever, but I'm sure they're committing bigger frauds as well, and they're just waiting to be discovered. And then I had a comment really on Mike's piece. So last year I interviewed Richard Levick, and I jumped up because one of the benefits of being at home is you can get the books off the shelf, and I'd recommend these books by Richard Levick to people. And he's a sort of PR guru in the US, one of the go-to crisis management guys. And his theory is that basically people are having to do more stuff around ESG, Black Lives Matters, etc., because there have been governments on both sides of the channel that haven't cared about that as much as they should have done. So, for example, corporations are getting more involved in environmental issues because until recently you had a president that didn't, and they were getting more involved in social responsibility because it was perceived that you had a president who didn't. And so what his theory is that if you like, corporations are being forced to fill that void left by governments getting out of the stuff they should be having an opinion on. I don't know if you had a view on that, Mike.
Well, I mean, hear to that. It's a frustration with the political system. And the fact is that now shareholders, stakeholders, or the general public now is demanding a greater responsibility and for companies to fill this in. If the government was doing a good job of regulation in this area, we would see less demand for this. I'm convinced of that, because the government would be mandating certain behaviors. They would be mandating, environmental controls. And I think what's going on in the country here, just to make it an even bigger political discussion, is that the majority will of the people is being frustrated by a system right now that is not based on representing the majority. You just go down every polling issue where, the people want certain legislation, but it doesn't go through the system because the way the system is designed here, and it needs to be reformed in that sense. So where do people go? They go to their workplace and they start to demand, okay, you've got money, you've got a position, you've got a place, a megaphone, and we want you to do this. What's interesting to me, though, is, and I just don't have the British, perspective because we're not elevated enough, but in terms of modern slavery, look, you guys were leaders on that. The British government was the leader on that issue, and they brought it and scared the Americans about it. Why aren't you dealing with this? And what I'm wondering is, what is it in the UK that leads companies to, or setting up their own corporate registry, the open corporates? I mean, it took us, legislation going through this past year to even get to the concept. We were a money laundering haven and still are for many reasons. But it seems to me like people are leading outside of us or within us. It's people are demanding that somebody take responsibility. So, I mean, I think it's an interesting development, and I think we're going to see more of it.
Mike, if I can just follow up on your point, I do think what you had said about the government isn't addressing these issues, so people are bringing it into the corporate workforce and having it try to address these things there. That is exactly what the Edelman Trust Barometer has been saying for several years now, that around the world, and especially in the United States, employees want their companies to take stronger stances on difficult social issues. And to your point about how this is happening because the will of the majority is being thwarted, which is true on many different issues. But I think now actually what we're seeing with, say, the voter suppression laws, to bring it back there, it is no longer just the case that what the majority wants isn't happening, but now what the minority wants is getting forced through.
Exactly. That's a great point.
Dysfunctional political system. And that's why the heat that CEOs already, they didn't like to be in this position when nothing was getting done, but now bad stuff is the only thing that's getting done. That puts them in all the worst position. And I don't know what the answer is, but that's exactly the dynamic here.
Well, that's a great point when you have the minority actually not just frustrating it, but they're absolutely putting in place what they want against the will of the majority. I couldn't agree more. One quick aside, I went to high school or junior high school with Rick Levick, and his transformation, Jonathan, into a guru. I've always told him that if I tell the truth about him, his reputation will go right downhill. Okay, because I saw where he came from, I saw his roots. But he's actually a friend of mine. But
really?
And he's very highly regarded. And but if you saw the real Rick Levick, he didn't speak with the same affect, is what I always tell him.
So I will just warn you, Mr. Volkov. If
I
you go
know
down that road. I was roommates in college with Mike's roommate in college.
Yeah, that was
it would not be pretty.
No, and the problem is, if I brought defamation actions, he'd have a good defense, which is the truth. So,
yeah.
so with that,
well,
Jonathan,
thanks all for inviting me to the final podcast.
we don't have any insurance on this, do we, Tom? Everything compliance needs an insurance policy.
The Compliance Podcast Network has full insurance. Risk management at its finest. Jonathan Marks, what is on your mind?
Well, before we get to that, since it's the Rich Levick show, I will tell you that he's an absolute mensch. I reached out to him. I met him about 10 years ago, and I had a couple of issues. And he said, if you ever need anything, call me. And I've called him several times, and he's always come, loaded with bear and willing to help. So, just a really nice human being and very knowledgeable in his space. So, Rich, if you're listening, thanks very much. Your fan club's online.
Wait. What's the kickback here? That's all I want to know. What's your kickback on this?
There's no kickback.
Okay.
Yeah. Always with an angle with bribery and corruption. I love it.
Yeah, you know how to bribe, Jonathan.
Yeah, there you go. We know it better than anyone, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I think for full disclosure, the books were a gift.
Oh, okay.
I will disclose off now.
That's all right. All right. So, on the ethics theme here, there was an article this week that one of my friends brought to my attention, which was Chinese police arrested, these 10 folks, and I'll get into this. They called themselves Chicken Drumstick, which is kind of interesting. And they were connected to an esports or a video game cheating ring. And these guys made, there's varying reports depending on what you read, but for illustrative purposes, $100 million in profit. And, I am not a gamer, but I did some research on this. And, esports, for those of you that don't know, it's a multiplayer video game played competitively for spectators. And I didn't even know this, that there were college programs, esports college programs. So more than 50 colleges, based on some of the information I looked, have varsity esport programs, and they're actually governed. There's a governing association related to all these called the National Association of Collegiate Esports, or NACE. And these championships are paid thousands of dollars in prize money, which is put towards the scholarship of winners. So it started me to think about really looking into this matter. And basically what these folks did was they sold subscriptions to hacks or cheats, to these games. And, like I said, I started to look at this from an ethical perspective, and it reminded me of a presentation that I did probably about 10 or 15 years ago. And there were some pretty alarming statistics that I rattled off in this presentation. So I just thought it'd be appropriate to share them today because they're kind of interesting. And, I think it will make for some good discussion. So of 4,000 high school students with A and B averages, 75% admit to cheating to get ahead. 92% of those said they cheated and were never caught. And you can look at my blog post for the references there. But more importantly than that, almost 80% of college students admit to cheating at least once. There was a junior achievement survey that found 80% of teens believe they were prepared to make ethical decisions when entering the workplace. Yet the group, nearly half, 49%, that they lying to their parents is okay, and 61% had done so in the past year. Here's something that's pretty shocking, which I'm sure we're not surprised about. Almost between 30 and 80% of people lie on their resume or job applications. And so digging a little deeper, you think it gets better with age. It really doesn't. A survey by USA Weekend found that 70% of 13-year-olds would return an extra dollar mistakenly given to them in change. Only 55% of 17-year-olds said they would do the same. Well, furthermore, in a survey conducted by the Girl Scouts of America, 65% of high school students reported they would cheat to pass an important exam, while only 53% of junior high school students and 21% of elementary school students would do the same. So my big question when I'm thinking about this, if you're a cheater in junior high or high school, or even in college, does that make you a cheater in the workplace? How do you control this? And so, let's look at some more alarming data. Almost 2 out of 5 bosses, or 39%, fail to keep their word. 1 in 4 supervisors, or 27%, insulated those they supervised as coworkers. Only 1 in 5, or 23%, blamed others for their mistakes. Almost 1 in 3, or 31%, used the silent treatment to show displeasure. All of these behaviors demonstrate that bosses lack personal values and personal ethics. And so, what do we look for when we're doing this and we're looking at, high integrity organizations? I kind of list out these certain attributes for the individual and the organization. But here are some common situations that I think we all encounter. The big lie justifies unethical actions. Verbal or written contracts obligate a person despite doubts. Roles are twisted to influence a person to act unethically. Vague rules justify unethical employee behavior or enable unjust management. And there's more and more and more that go on to this. So, the new ethics paradigm, I think understanding culture is key, and it's often ignored. I do think that based on this chicken drumstick thing, I don't know, this organization that manages these college students, this NASA not-for-profit that I found, National Association of Collegiate Esports, I looked on their website, doesn't say anything about compliance and ethics. Really alarming to me. And so, I guess my advice here is that it's kind of interesting. I mean, I don't know how you determine, if someone's, if someone you're hiring was a cheater in their past life, but it certainly brings up the point that we all keep talking about. It's sort of the 10-80-10 rule. 10% of the people in your organization are ethical, 80% are situationally ethical, and 10% of the people are unethical and committing fraud right underneath your nose. So, what does that mean? I think we just need to be really vigilant and diligent with regards to ethics and compliance programs. And, we need to make sure, I think we have it right. I think the regulators have it right. I think they keep pushing, when they're evaluating corporate compliance programs. I think there's a reason for all of this. And, this really hit home for me because it made me think a little bit about, that whole manifestation of people coming up through high school and college and are now in your workplace, and the ones that are situationally ethical, how do you keep them, within that particular box? The 10% are already committing fraud or unethical. There's really, that's really a detection or prevention type of an exercise. The 80% that are situationally ethical, how do you really control or contain them? And it just brings up a great topic for conversation.
Jonathan Armstrong, we've had a question from one of our listeners. Could you handle that for us?
Yeah, we've had a few actually, and I guess thanks for all of them. One of them is around what are the lessons to be learned from SolarWinds, and will that have a permanent place in compliance agendas? And the other one is, should consumers' information be protected, and should there be time limits on that? I suppose I've got a quick view on both. The second one first. I think in GDPR and in UK GDPR as well, there are limits on holding consumer data. They're somewhat vague. They say you can only hold the data for so long as is necessary, and it has to be accurate and up to date. So I think we are seeing an increasing conflict, if you like, which we've had forever, of the type of things Jonathan Marks has talked about big data and sweating data for trends, versus that conflict with privacy and deleting data when it's no longer needed. And you do get that conflict in things like investigations in France, for example, where the French regulator says, as a rule of thumb, data should be destroyed 2 months after the investigation is over. But as far as general consumer information is concerned, then that is protected. As far as SolarWinds is concerned, for those of you who haven't followed that story, it's a supplier to many corporations of software that helps manage their online threat landscape, if you like, and that software was itself compromised. I guess it might be another topic that we could return to in a future podcast, Tom, but I think there is a real inequality at the moment in the cybersecurity world between 2 or 3 nations that are not only funding state-sponsored attacks on corporations in the US, the UK, and in the west of Europe, but they're also, if you like, promoting cyber anarchy as well by training people up who then work out that they can get better money working for African gangs or South American gangs or organized crime. And they know that they're going to be protected by the state. So whilst they're working, if you like, for private enterprise, not for government, they're being protected by the state because that's a way of fermenting discord. And I think SolarWinds has taught us those dangers, really. And sometimes, of course, the targets of these attacks are governments, not corporations. But all too often, corporations are collateral damage in those attacks. So that's a whistle stop to both questions. And I guess we thank the questioner for both.
So that questioner was Nick Kroll, and Nick also put a link into the Netflix presentation on Varsity Blues, the college cheating scandal. It's an excellent program. So thanks to Nick for pointing that out. And for listeners, if you're on Netflix or have that available to you, I would heartily suggest you check it out. Gentlemen, we are now to our fan favorite part of the show, rants and shout outs. Perhaps other than listening to Mike Volkoff's college shenanigans, it's going to be, that might be the most favorite part of the show going forward, but we'll save that for another episode. We're going to go in the same order. So, Mr. Armstrong, you have a rant and or shout out.
It's a bit of both, I suppose. Shout out to the BBC. Most of the mainstream media, other than the Murdoch-owned, what would you call them, output, and the BBC on Sunday, ran a story which sort of wasn't news about Boris's, one-man US-UK trade deal, who goes by the name of Jennifer Arcuri. And she was somebody, it seems, that she's an American businesswoman. It seems that Boris met her at a conference. She had been seen leaving his premises on a number of occasions when he was mayor of London. I think he'd admitted to having IT help desk services from her, and that surprisingly turned out to be something of a euphemism for other things. And on Sunday, she started her serialized story in a newspaper, and she said that, surprise, surprise, it wasn't just the laptop she was looking at for him. And but the real scandal here, I suppose, is twofold. I mean, firstly, there's the fact that a serving prime minister seems to have misled the public. And secondly, the fact that Miss Arcuri seems to have got well over £100,000 of public money whilst she was having this relationship with Boris Johnson as Mayor of London and then in his various offices since. And my disappointment, I suppose, I'm normally a big supporter of the BBC. I think they've got a very difficult job to do in getting the political balance right. They covered the story that everybody else, as I say, absent one set of outlets, covered on Sunday. The BBC finally covered the story on Thursday after huge outrage on social media. And they tucked it away into a very odd story about the fact that the Conservative Party had funded Boris's legal expenses to defend himself from accusations that we now know were true. So it seemed to be an odd way of breaking their silence. But I'm particularly disappointed that the BBC didn't run the story on Sunday. It looks to be true. She has photographs in Boris's house, whilst some people report Boris's wife was away having cancer treatment. It doesn't sound like a story that the Prime Minister is proud of, but that doesn't mean to say that the BBC should be silenced.
Matt Kelly.
Yeah, I have a shout out today on a somewhat serious and somber note, but a shout out nonetheless to Darnella Frazier. And if that name rings a bell, or even if it doesn't, you should know the name, because Darnella Frazier is the now 18-year-old woman who shot the video that most of us have seen of George Floyd when police officer Derek Chauvin put his knee on George Floyd's neck, and ultimately George Floyd then died. So the trial for Derek Chauvin started this week in Minneapolis, and one of the first people to call to testify was Darnella Frazier. And she had said while testifying that since she recorded and I guess uploaded the video, she spent many nights apologizing to George Floyd, wherever he may be now, that she did not do more. And I think we should just give a big debt of credit to Darnella for what she already did. What would have happened if people like her had not caught what happened that day on video and shared it with potentially we'd never have known about that particular incident. But she has no reason to beat herself up, even if she's going to. She did a great service to the American public by recording that video, by sharing it, and forcing all of us to confront what is still a very ugly part of the American underbelly here. I don't know what the answer will be with the Derek Chauvin's trial or just the Black Lives Matter movement generally, but we all owe her a big debt of thanks for recording that video and sharing it with everybody and then testifying today. However she might feel about what else she could have done, I don't know that she could have done anything more. She was only 17 at the time, but good American, and she did a great thing, and we should all be thankful for her help with us getting through this very difficult ordeal.
Mike Volkov.
Well, here, Matt. I've been watching the trial, and it's actually quite upsetting. And there, not only was Darnella a hero, but there are other heroes as well who've testified, and the uniformity of the feeling of people that they felt guilty, that they should have done something more, is really just powerful to be in a position like that. And I thought so. I will tell you this, as a trial attorney, I've found the performance of probably both sides to be lacking in terms of the way that they're presenting this. But all trial attorneys, when they watch somebody else do a trial, always think that they can do it better. But nonetheless, it's been really a powerful trial. But just to go to another topic, here to the federal prosecutors handling the Matt Gaetz investigation. I can't think of a better subject, soon to be target of an investigation. And lo and behold, those, how many times in political history have we seen those that go around proselytizing that they're holier than thou in some respects turn out to have their own sort of dark underside? And I think we should have known. There's an interesting fact in the case that, the investigation started by, was specifically had to be approved by Bill Barr, and was. And when there was a meeting on the Hill at which Bill Barr was supposed to go to, at which Matt Gaetz was going to be present, Barr canceled his attendance at that meeting. So that lets you know that even in December of last year, when this occurred, that the evidence against Gaetz was such that we're in this situation right now. They're trying to obviously flip this guy Greenberg, who is associated with Barr. I mean, not with Barr, with Gaetz. And what is funny is each day this guy goes to bed, Greenberg, and I say that facetiously, he wakes up with a superseding indictment with more charges. He went from 12 to 33 charges in the space of 2 superseding indictments. So can't think of a better target. And if there's anybody who I would think would be the most gleeful, it would be Liz Cheney. Who I'm sure is enjoying it. And I have a special place for Liz Cheney because when I represented Alex Vindman, and after he was attacked viciously by Fox News as a spy, a Ukrainian spy, he that night, and after it had come out about this, Liz Cheney actually called Alex Vindman's wife, and said and apologized and told her and wanted to know if she could help the family in any way. So Liz Cheney, no matter what your politics may be, to me, I've always sort of defended her as a really good person, and I thought that showed that she did the right thing then. And I think that Matt Gaetz going into her district in the way that he did, she must be enjoying this incident right now.
Jonathan Marks.
I have a rave and a rant. I'll make them quick. So my rave is for Special Agent, now I'm going to lose her name, Kerry Harney out of the FBI Tampa's field office for basically busting a Ponzi scheme related to concert investments, which turned out to be about $20 million. Andres Fernandez was a concert promoter and basically duped people into guaranteeing them 100% return on their investment. And I think the FBI did a great investigation there. And, I think that Special Agent Haney did a great job in pulling all the pieces together. So that's my rave. And my rant is, what I talked about before. I would have thought the National Association for Collegiate Esports would at least come out with some type of press release, talking about this, chicken drumstick thing and how they do not condone cheating or some type of ethical stance. It just surprises me and continues to surprise me, the way higher ed treats some of these situations. And, even though this is not related specifically to a, one particular college or university, esports is a growing field in the college environment. And I would have thought that the governing body would at least come out and have addressed this. I have not seen anything. I looked. If there's something out there, I sincerely apologize. But, I don't know who's doing their press. Maybe we should call Rich Levick and, tell them how to write a press release or deal with this particular crisis. But, certainly something that really upsetted me.
I have a shout out to John Boehner, former Speaker of the House, who gave a lengthy interview for Two Politico, which has published the article. And there's one quote that struck me as perhaps the gold of all time. Quote, "There is nothing more dangerous than a reckless asshole who thinks he is smarter than everyone else. Ladies and gentlemen, meet Senator Ted Cruz." End quote. Thank you, John Boehner. Gentlemen, it's been a ton of fun, and I look forward to getting back together.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Tom.
Take care. Bye now.